In 1857, Townsend Harris was sent by the United States to Japan to begin establishing a relationship between the two countries. He arrived in Edo, which is now known as Tokyo, and a year later, in 1858, Japan and the United States signed a treaty of amity and commerce, which opened the door for not only trade, but eventually opened the door for their citizens to be able to visit each other's countries and beginning a deeper relationship. This was a key time period for Japan after a period of isolation for hundreds of years, and this also opened the door for the beginning of the history of Tokyo Union Church. Welcome to this edition of Tokyo Union Church, where we're going to talk about how the past informs our future. In this edition, we're going to look at the Tokyo Union Church community and specifically a place to call home. The times when TUC gathered at specific buildings and looking at a little bit of the history of TUC's buildings, but also the times when there were no physical locations to call home and how that tells and teaches us what the future may look like for us. Back before Tsukiji was known as a place for the fish market, it was a bit different for those who were living in Edo, now known as Tokyo. It was a place where the foreigners who were coming from overseas were to call home. It was literally reclaimed land. That's what Tsukiji meant. But it was here where we first see the beginning of the history of TUC. This is a look at the map from 1869 where the Tsukiji Foreign Settlement had these lots, and land was still pretty expensive. You would think it may not be so expensive back in the day with the foreigners living over there, but for 24 lots, the value was $28,500 then. It's more than $1 million US dollars today. And in lot number 17, this is where the Union Church was to be located. There was a building approved for the Union Church services in February of 1872, and the building was dedicated sometime in July or September of that year. Records are a little bit fuzzy at that time. But this was a particularly important location because this is where, at the time, all the foreigners had settled in the city. Many were actually waiting outside of Tokyo over in places like Yokohama and were waiting to come into the city. And so once the door opened, they moved in, and this is where we see the Union Church gathering taking place. It was a very important time for them as the building was dedicated. This is a picture of the TUC building in Tsukiji in 1875. You may notice the steeple located on top of one of the buildings. It was known for that. It was clearly a place where it was a house of worship, and it had a lot of activities taking place aside from just the English-speaking services. We also had Tokyo's first Japanese church gathering in this building for the first few years of the Union Church building's existence, along with even the German congregation, a German congregation gathering in this building for some time in its existence. And so it was an incredible time of gathering, and interestingly enough, there were some things that were taking place back in 1875 that seemed to be common to what's happening today. Arthur Collins Maclay, who was known for this budget of letters from Japan, said this back in 1875. Many young Japanese go to the missionaries to learn English and, of course, receive much scriptural instruction with it. The zealous missionaries take turns in preaching to the English-speaking residents every Sunday morning, and it is to be hoped that this will form a permanent feature of their work here. We see how English is such an important tool to be able to connect with those living in Japan. That's the case back then, and that's even happening now. There's even still at TUC a language exchange program that's been taking place where Japanese and English speakers would share and exchange English and Japanese language learning. And so that's been an important part of TUC's history. On top of that, we still see the importance of the preaching of God's word every Sunday morning. And that was a hope that will continue to be a permanent feature of the work of the missionaries in Japan. On top of that, TUC also had a very important role in witnessing to the church itself. Isabella Bird in Unbeaten Tracks in Japan said in her book, "There is a complete nest of missionary church edifices, a wonderful testimony to the shattered unity of the Christian church, and the number of houses occupied by missionaries is very large." We see that in the midst of change, and in the midst of the fact that it was just a growing place, people from all different Christian backgrounds gathered together in unity. And that was the hope and desire of having a union church. And that continues to be the hope and desire of TUC today. After staying in Tsukiji for about 3 decades, it was decided that Tokyo Union Church would move on from their location in Tsukiji and move westward toward Ginza. But in the process, they no longer had a building. It was a church without a home. So they moved westward, and at the time would meet in places like Tsukiyabashi Presbyterian Church. You'll see here toward the center of your screen, number 1. And also Ginza Methodist Church, number 2, which was a primary location for Tokyo Union Church, especially starting around 1913, and that lasted for a couple of decades. There are also some other locations toward Roppongi, and then in Toranomon, there was a building lot purchased in 1922 in order to build a location for Tokyo Union Church. It was very important for the members of the church to have a place to gather together, because when they were gathering at Ginza Methodist Church, they were busy in the afternoons, because in the morning, those at Ginza Methodist Church would gather together for their services. There was an attempt to build a building in 1923 before the Great Kanto earthquake hit, and that leveled any progress that they made at that time, and also destroyed the Ginza Methodist Church in the process. So there was even another decade where Tokyo Union Church did not have a building to gather at, and this caused a bit of difficulty. This quote from Robert Hemphill, A Church for All Seasons, which all of this research comes from, has this statement to say about the situation. Would Tokyo Union Church ever be able to afford a building of its own again? The Wanderer identity was wearing thin. 2 or 3 gathered together in his name were a church, to be sure, but would they always have to be a tenant church? It was very important for the members of Tokyo Union Church to have a place to call home. And so, through the difficulties that came from the earthquake, eventually the location in Toranomon was sold, and the location that was purchased was located in what is now Omotesando. And in 1930, this TUC building was dedicated. It was an important place because it was an opportunity for people to gather once again, and having the connection with those around this area, having a place to worship, having a place to have Sunday school, and all sorts of activities. That was just the center of life for many at this time. This location served home for quite a few decades, but the building did not always stand. You may notice it's around the time where we talk about World War II and the Tokyo firebombing that took place, and it really did destroy the building. Here's a picture after the war in 1950, and you notice, a part of the building, the front part of it is there, but everything behind there was destroyed by the bombing. There was a lot of work and efforts to restore the facility, and eventually they were able to do that and stayed at this location, at least until the 1970s, when they realized we need more space. We're growing, and we're having a building that can't support the growth that we need. So there was a decision made to tear down the old building and build a new one. There was, however, a petition that was circulated in the Omotesando Harajuku neighborhood, pleading with Tokyo Union Church to say, please do not destroy this building. We have lost so much of the old character of this neighborhood. Tokyo Union Church has been a big part of this neighborhood. If you can please keep it. And they asked people to sign this petition. It unfortunately had already been decided that the building was to be demolished. And so we see the building removed. And once again, during that time period, Tokyo Union Church was meeting at 5 different locations in a period of 1 year. But then in 1980, Tokyo Union Church was able to dedicate their building, and it may look familiar because it's the current building that we are gathering at. And we've been here for the past few decades. But there was an interruption during the past few years where even though TUC had a building, we couldn't gather at the building. And you probably know the history. You've lived through it. In March of 2020, the World Health Organization declared a pandemic with the coronavirus COVID-19 situation, and that changed the way TUC gathered because they couldn't gather in person. All the activities that were taking place inside the church had to temporarily stop. But the leadership decided, we are a church, not just the building. And so in the process, we had the launch of the live stream along with the morning meetups, and it has allowed TUC to really flourish and grow. A community that's not only just inside the building, but also outside the building. And we've seen some changes even over the past few months. We were able to celebrate the 150-year anniversary in the building as well as outside the building, all together through our live stream and online capabilities, plus a plethora of so many different ways of gathering through pastoral investigations, a hybrid men's breakfast, the women's Bible study, the Lectio Divina. The morning meetups were crucial in that development, and the Sermon Lab has also gone online. We also have the Adult Christian Education class, which has allowed us to walk through history and be able to learn more about Christianity in Japan. And it's offered both in person and online in distinct but yet unified experiences. So we see how TUC has adjusted and moved through times where, whether with the building or without the building, TUC has continued as a community. And we see that linking over the past 150 years, the way that the church has grown and served the community. The question is, how does this past inform our future? This is what our discussion will be in today's Adult Christian Education class.